My name is Jeremy Cohen. I'm the director of the honors program, and I'm so pleased to welcome everybody tonight to our gala panel event to celebrate the publication of this, as they used to call it, this handsome volume. Is every time I pick it up, that's what I think. What a handsome volume. Is Art History by Svetlana Alpers, a collection of essays from throughout her career. You'll hear more about Svetlana later in the evening, so I'm not going to do too much by way of introduction of her here, but I am going to say just a couple things real quick. First of all, this is an event that is part of the Art and Politics lecture series, which is co-sponsored by the SVA Honors Program, which I direct, and the BFA Visual and Critical Studies Program, directed by Tom Hoon over there. We have lectures throughout the year, about once a month, to touch on the complex intersections of art and politics in light of the contemporary crises that humanity faces, crises of the climate, of the economy, of democracy, of equality and justice, and so much more. So we try to think about the intersections of where art and politics do and don't touch each other in the past, in the present, and invite speakers from all walks of scholarship, activism, intellectual life to come and think with us together. So I'm really pleased for this event, and at the end I'll talk a little bit about our next event, November 18th, a post-election event to come. I know it's something on all of our minds. But without too much further ado, I want to introduce the two speakers who will be beginning our panel tonight. And let me also thank, while I'm up here, Barney Kulak from Hunter Points Press, who helped organize this event. Maybe we can give him a hand. I'm really excited for us to be having this event together. People who are familiar with Svetlana's work know its range and its breadth and its intervention in so many fields and its reflection on so many artists. So I think we'll have a lot of room to range tonight, and we'll hear a bit from our panelists, and then we'll have plenty of time to talk together. Also, by the way, just an invitation for people who are sitting near the back. I was just telling Luna, our student worker who's helping out tonight, I was just telling her that, I'm a sociologist by training, and the only true sociological law I know is that in a big space, if you give people the opportunity, they will sit way towards the back. So feel free to break that sociological law this evening and move up a little bit if you wish. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our initial speakers in the panel this evening. All the way to my right is Professor Evelyn Lincoln. She's a professor emerita at Brown University, where she taught in the departments of the history of art and architecture and Italian studies since 1994. Her interest in the role of printmaking in forging communities of readers, writers, and artists in the early modern world is the impetus for her current book, The View from 1600, The Parasol Family Roman Woodblock Enterprise, soon forthcoming from Routledge Press. And then to her left, stage left, is Richard Meyer, who we're also welcoming this evening. Richard Meyer is the Robert and Ruth Halperin Professor in Art History at Stanford University. He's the author, most recently, of The Master of Two Left Feet, Morris Hirschfeld Reconsidered. He is currently a fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center and will next September become the director of the American Studies program. So let's give our two opening guests a real huge round of applause and welcome them to SVA.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that introduction, and welcome everybody. And I can't see you because of the lights, but I know you're there. So Richard and I have a history that we'll tell you about in a minute with Svetlana, but we're really here to introduce and talk about our history and Svetlana Alpers' history with this newest book. And we would like to begin by thanking Tom Hoon and the School of Visual Arts for allowing us to come do this. And importantly, really, this book wouldn't be here without Barney Kulak, who I think is over there, who is a photographer and has collaborated with Svetlana on a photography project about the surface of Tiepolo's paintings, and also the founder of Hunters Point Press. And he's really responsible for publishing this rich collection of essays, lectures, book reviews, and conversations, some of which are difficult to find because they're not, if you're an art historian, they're not published, some of these in regular art history journals. They range from places like New Literary History and Daedalus to catalog essays in the small volumes that accompany exhibitions for contemporary artists. So some of these have never been published before and are completely new to readers of Svetlana's work, or to her usual audience, I would say. And I'd also like to call out Jillian Malpass, who isn't with us today, but is a really talented editor and book designer who put this book together and is responsible really for the visual impact and the layout of this book, which is such a pleasure to hold in your hand, to go from text to thumbnail images to beautiful color images at the back, and making it such a pleasure to engage with, even just as an object. But most of all, perhaps, we want to thank Svetlana Alpers for collaborating with Barney to put this book before our eyes and into our hands. The book also has a very insightful introduction, beautifully written by Richard. And you'll hear a little bit from that in a few minutes. And in this book, and as he explains in his introduction, readers of Is Art History follow Svetlana as she writes her way through a lifetime, really, of looking and thinking about pictures. At first, mostly paintings, then paintings and photographs, and even film, which she likens to paintings in part. And the essays in this book range from a 1960 essay right out of the gate when she was a graduate student at Harvard in the art history department, writing about Vasari's descriptive writing, up to her thoughts on seeing the Juan de Pareja exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum in 2023, so just last year. And what we're going to do is just start with a short discussion between us, and then welcome Svetlana onto the stage to speak all together, and then open this up to questions from everybody. So I should start by saying that Richard and I met in the fall of 1988, both of us East Coast people, New Yorkers, who were in California and went to, joined or became graduate students at the University of California at Berkeley in that year, and took a required seminar. It was called the Pro Seminar, which Richard just told me he didn't know what it meant, professional seminar, that was really designed to introduce us. And this was a new class at the time. Now I think if any of you are grad students in art history, I think these are offered everywhere now. But this was a class that was designed by Svetlana to introduce first-year graduate students to the, I'm going to say methods and techniques, but we didn't call it a methods class. It was really called a seminar in which, as when you read this book, you'll realize was designed to really teach us about the nature of looking, as she writes in here, and also how to introduce us to approaches that we could productively borrow from contiguous disciplines ranging from anthropology to literary criticism. That class was, both of us agree, a kind of crucible, not only because it was contentious, we talked over each other, we argued with each other, we didn't understand things and then came to understand them. But this is really a crucible for our intellectual formation as art historians, which we both then became as our vocation, but we'll be talking a little bit about this too. It was also our lives after that point. Yeah.
I just want to say, Evie asked me to talk over her tonight, and in order to bring back the spirit of the pro seminar. And I, usually people ask me not to talk over them because that is a bad habit that I have of interrupting. But I just wanted to say that neither Evie or I became historians of the field for which Svetlana remains, or the area of art history, which is to say 17th century Dutch art, that Svetlana remains or was best known for. So we didn't follow in her footsteps, but as you'll hear, Svetlana didn't follow in her own footsteps because she has moved so widely from her specialization. And I think maybe one of the things we began to intuit, it was never said, is that staying within your field is not perhaps the most intellectually satisfying or productive way to be a thinker about art. When I say staying within your field, I don't mean like damning your colleagues in the field, or I don't mean like leaving it entirely, like divorcing your field as the alternative to staying within, but actually to thinking about the work you do as engaged with a set of questions that extend well beyond any one cultural moment or set of objects, and just and do. Not letting you interrupt, right? But I will in a moment. But just, I think that again, without it being spoken, and it's interesting to me in terms of working with Svetlana, and when I say working with her for years, that was teaching her work without actually being in dialogue with her, because I've taught her work in every method seminar, which and also writing courses about writing about art that I've taught. So there was a conversation I was having with Svetlana that then became real when we met up again after decades of not having been in touch, which maybe we can talk about a little bit later. Yeah. But I don't even remember where I was going, so please.
I'll interrupt you then productively.
Yes.
But I think the idea of not following in academic footsteps and the role of the academy in what it was that we were learning in that seminar is important, because it became increasingly diminished. It wasn't the academy itself. It was following the footsteps that we, I think, learned to follow, or the footsteps we see her following, the paths that she follows in this book, which, because the essays are chronological and are linked that way, we can see Svetlana thinking, rethinking, bringing back ideas from her first articles on Velázquez or on Rembrandt, and bringing them to bear again on, say, entering a show of Tacita Dean's work or Shirley Jaffe's. So,
How so? How do you mean that they return?
Well, when she begins to talk about, say, Tacita Dean, you'll see that as she enters the show, she's talking about bodies that are different than Rubens's bodies. These are painterly film stills, but not, so comparing these to paintings and things like that. So bringing back ideas that are first mentioned, and this is an opportunity to follow that thinking sort of chronologically in a way that you wouldn't normally do in just reading a series of articles. So the collection itself is more than just the individual articles stacked up. The fact that they're chronological.
I mean, maybe this is a moment where we should, or I will step back and just say a little bit about what the book is, that it includes, and you're going to help me here in a moment. But so the first, when Evie says chronological, she doesn't mean chronological in terms of the subject matter or the period of art that is being dealt with in the essays. She means chronological in terms of publication date. And one of the things I say in the introductory essay is these essays are all dated in the sense that it's very clear when they were published, but they're not dated in the sense of seeming to have been written decades ago. Actually, the most recent one, in the last essay in the book, is a review of the Wanda Perea show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art last year. But as I said, the first is from when Svetlana was a student, and it's about Vasari, who in many ways, the Italian Renaissance painter, now much better known as the chronicler of artists' lives, and sometimes thought of as the first art historian. You could see what I call a lifetime of looking in this book, but it doesn't feel ever to me nostalgic or confined by different, say, fashions of theoretical, critical theory or art historical there's a particular art historical mode. It's really motivated by questions of looking closely at arts, but then also what it means to write about that looking. And to have the viewer then look, in writing your words, look differently and anew at what you looked at.
And this is exactly the sort of, the essay that gives the book its title, Is Art History, is actually a question that was brought up in this prose seminar, this crucible seminar, this
and Evie was insistent that we talk a lot about the prose seminar, which, okay, we can. I said we could.
Can't stop me.
It is how the three of us met, and was a sort of,
but the question at the time was a confounding one. I mean, we were sitting there, we wanted to become credentialized, as you and I did, as art historians, or as my artist parents would say, art hysterians. And this is what we wanted, but Svetlana says, is art history? In what way is art history? What is art a text? Is art and I don't think at that point we had actually read this article, but in it are beautifully laid out and clearly laid out the what art is to or what it is in the world and was at that time. And it's no less important and fresh now than it was when she wrote it in, I think, 1977. Really, more than 10 years before we actually showed up in her lives. And in it, she lays out what those things are that are so important to becoming an art historian, the basic assumptions in sense of art historians. I wrote it down because it was so good, but the ideas of the authority of the individual maker, for example, the notion of the uniqueness of a work of art, and even the centrality of the institution of painting, and all these things were called into question in that class, and then unbeknownst to me at the time, or any of us at the time, in that article, to go back to now and see how it was that we began to question these assumptions.
I guess I want to slightly, not disagree, but inflect or come from an oblique angle. Mm-hmm. Because I feel that one of the things for me personally that's inspiring about Svetlana's work and the way she's shaped her work in relation to her life, or maybe shaped her life in part in relation to her work, is that the field of art history and being an art historian, I don't think that marks the limit. The fact that Svetlana left the academy, I'm forgetting exactly the date, but Svetlana, what was the date?
94.
25 years ago. 25 years ago, at a very young age, we're not using the word retire, but to make that transition. And she but she continued to write books and essays and reviews. And she built a framework, an intellectual and creative framework, in large part through conversations and looking with artists, but also with critics, writers, some art historians. I mean, I think I belatedly maybe became part of that framework, and you were always there, but it wasn't primarily art historians. And I think that is telling to me. Svetlana was, as she said to me, kind of proudly, she was never the chair of our department. She built that department, the Berkeley department, which eventually included T.J. Clark and Svetlana's closest interlocutor, Michael Baxendall, and Evie's advisor, and many other people who now I'm suddenly forgetting, Carol Armstrong, and other very prominent lights. But
historians who fade into the
right?
past.
But I think that for me, at this moment in my life, what I recognize is this desire not to be academic in one's thinking or one's address to the world.
That's going to get us into the bit that it would be great if you could read from your introduction. Sure. And so maybe we can listen for one moment to something that Richard very, I think, brilliantly said about Svetlana's work. I wrote it out if you want to read it from.
Yeah, but I didn't necessarily want to read that passage. But maybe that one fits better now. And I wanted to read a different passage. But okay, I think it was Roland Barthes who said the easiest way to read a book is to write it. But I do not find, and Svetlana wrote this book, but I'm now trying to find in my own essay that I wrote something to read, and I don't find it that easy. But anyway, I will read
this
what
nice paragraph.
I'll follow the script, even though reluctantly. Okay.
This is quite a bit like the Pro Seminar, actually.
Okay, you have different memories of it, because what I remember most is Svetlana interrupting everyone and cutting us all off. Okay. Quote, scholars tend to fit themselves, or rather to be fit, into narrow boxes of specialization. Academic training and professional expectations impose limits on what constitutes an acceptable field of expertise. Alpers refuses these. Once she accomplishes what she has set out to do within a particular domain, she moves on to the next. About 10 years ago, I had the occasion to introduce her to a public audience at Stanford University. I described her as a leading scholar of Old Master European painting, which is how she is best known. At the time, yet unbeknownst to me, she was beginning to write Walker Evans, Starting from Scratch, a major book on the modernist photographer and his distinctive modes of looking and reading. None of the categories I had invoked, Old Master, European, painting, were applicable to her work in progress. Pointing this out, if I had known it, would have been the best way to introduce Alpers. She is a category buster. Okay, that wasn't bad, that selection.
If you do say so yourself.
Right.
So let's talk about this category buster, because I think that was important to not only both of us, and allowed people like us to become artists, for art history to be the best sort of carapace for us to do what we really wanted to do without thinking of it as a limiting thing, but something that allowed us to do this work. So there were all kinds of restrictions that she did bust. I mean, I'll start by saying she busted retirement for me. I mean, Richard's mom, who's sitting over here, said that I could call it promotion instead of retirement. But that not working for the university still means that one can be involved in this lifelong occupation of thinking and writing about pictures, and so she made it something that I felt that I could do happily and joyously. Plus, she was very aggressive about pushing me to do it. But anyway, so what other categories would you say were productively busted for you in reading the works in this book?
It's hard for me to, reading the works in the book?
Yeah, well, we're talking about this book here.
I thought you were going back to the prose.
No.
Well, I want to convey to those in the audience who may not know this that I believe that Svetlana identifies herself as an art historian, as do we, but it's extremely rare to find someone who works on, let's call it Old Master, I know problematic title, but let's say European painting of the, tell me what centuries I should say.
17th.
But not only the 17th.
No.
Okay.
You're saying what is an Old Master painting?
No, just what centuries should I? Anyway, it's from old master paintings, old paintings, but
not contemporary
and not modern, early. Anyway, but then to write a book on Walker Evans, and not only that, it's not only that she worked on Walker Evans, but that she writes on a review of Tacita Dean, or a piece for Art in America, I think it was, on the strangeness of Vermeer, which is not leaving her field of expertise, but it's leaving the fora in which that field is meant, the scholarly field unfolds. And I think also what Svetlana, the work on the rehanging of the galleries in the Louvre, what Svetlana is very attentive to, and this is something I learned, and I didn't realize I was learning it, was what it means to look in the moment. Okay, we're looking at Vermeer, we're looking at Tiepolo, but we're looking at those works right now. That doesn't mean she's bringing in all sorts of contemporary social or political phenomena. It means that she's bringing in the act of looking. It's, I think, so often why the art and the looking are in the present tense in this book. Because it's not about 400 years ago people looked at this. Or, I mean, not that that's unimportant, and sometimes if there's a if the issue is, well, what was the period eye? But I think more often, and what touches me, or what is this idea that it matters now. It mattered then, and it still matters now. And that, I think, again, it wasn't, I'm interested, I remember when I said I can't remember what I was going to say? I'm like,
you remember?
Yeah, which is, I mean, there's so much that isn't said explicitly in a classroom, so much that maybe isn't even fully conscious by the teacher or the students, but that you may take away with you and not realize till later in life that you've been given that gift.
Yeah, I mean, teachers always have this, you get wonderful letters from students where not only does the penny drop many years later, but a penny is dropping that you didn't even know you had scattered,
Well, I hope it's not a penny,
like
maybe like a quarter? Or,
pennies are important. But you when we were talking about this, you mentioned that it was the directness in a lot of ways of Svetlana's writing that really impressed you, this sense in her writing that she was discovering in her thinking and writing what she was going to be saying, like she writing in order to. And this article that that Richard just mentioned is a meditation in a way on entering the Louvre when the Dutch paintings that she had grown up with and thought about and written about for years had been rehung. So it was like seeing old friends in completely different circumstances, judging this, thinking about what it meant. In a way, there was a paradigmatic essay for me for the book itself, reviewing old articles that she had known in particular circumstances, then rehung, in a sense, by being collected in this book. But there's this sense, a spatial sense of her walking around the Louvre, introducing herself or re-encountering these old paintings, that also is in the directness of the writing about walking into an exhibition of Tacitus films and encountering them first through sound and then through vision, and that so you do as well. And that directness, you said, was very important for you.
Yeah, I mean, the issue about which I think we're going to invite Svetlana up very soon, right? But the one thing that she said, which we want to ask her about, is this notion of writing, not because you've made these discoveries that you feel like the world has to, that are so important that or that are going to advance your career, so you want to publish them or present them, but rather writing to figure something out. So that the act of writing is actually a way of thinking. And in other words, not that you've already figured it all out beforehand and you're then just translating it, as it were, into words that can be published, but actually in writing those words, you're learning something that you wouldn't have understood.
And then it also shows up in another category of things that are in this book that I've really never read before in collected essays are pieces that Svetlana wrote when close and dear friends have died, and she's memorialized them. And that's something in particular that she wrote about Michael Padro, I believe, that he wrote to her, "I love writing to you because I think I can tell what I'm thinking about. I can clarify what I'm thinking about." So it's writing as a way of thinking things through. And sometimes they're to particular people, or for particular people, as well as for oneself.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that the act of publication means that you are then asking people who aren't that person to engage in this way of knowing, or set of thoughts. And I will just say, I mean, partially because I know Evie thinks that I should, or that this would be good to say. But when I was Svetlana's student, so both Evie and I were, well, no, this may be not true of you, sorry. But I was only Svetlana's student for that one semester, which was my very first semester. Although Svetlana was such a force in the department that I was always aware of her. And back in the day, there was more of a, I would say, departmental intellectual culture where you interacted at events, and
people came in,
right,
and physically.
People actually showed up for guest lectures. Anyway, there are 2 graduate students from Stanford, so I don't want to get in trouble, but I wish more graduate students showed up for guest lectures. Anyway, we do go to a lot of trouble to invite people, but. And more importantly, sometimes it's interesting, not as often as it should be. But what were we talking about? So when Svetlana, that one semester, feminism was included in the pro-seminar, the method seminar. There was a week on feminism, and I was extremely interested in feminism, and I had worked with feminist professors. In fact, a student of Svetlana's, Celeste Brusati, who I worked with as an undergraduate 2 years before, who had taught this course that I loved called Women in the Art of Painting in Early Modern Europe, which was both about female artists and the representation of women. But, and Celeste remains a close interlocutor and friend and former student of Svetlana's. But Svetlana did not identify as feminist, and she was strongly, I would say, not identifying as feminist. Do you think that's fair? I guess we should.
We can ask her.
Yes, and I was sort of like troubled by this, like why? And this is I'm about to share a very weird thing. I've not mentioned it to Svetlana in 35 years, and I don't even know if she'll remember. Svetlana, when you come up, I'm going to ask you, do you remember? But we had read Laura Mulvey, which is, in part, about this idea of to-be-looked-atness, that the female body in classical Hollywood film is coded as the object to be looked at. And the male gaze, whether you're male or female, or now we would say, or otherwise, or non-binary, that it is a male gaze that you are asked to assume when you're watching a classical Hollywood movie, a film, and that the female body is objectified, fetishized, and offered up for your pleasure. So, and this was an extremely influential essay. So Svetlana was like, I just don't believe in this male gaze. I don't think, she kind of just, was dismissive, as I remember it. And I said, and this was my great achievement of the semester, I said, Svetlana, when you and your husband, who was Paul Alpers, who was, an English professor at Berkeley, and in his, well known in his own field, whatever, I said, when you look at a picture of a female, a naked woman, and I wouldn't have said Paul, I mean Paul Albert, your husband looks at a picture of a naked woman, do you think you see the same thing? And Svetlana said, no. And that was my triumph, that there was an acknowledgement of a difference. Anyway, I know that seems pathetic, but I was so wrapped up in identity, including, I was trying to figure out, there wasn't really queer studies quite yet in art history, but I was also just this big believer that sort of our work comes out of our lives, which of course it does, but not in a way that can be confined to any one name we give ourselves, one part of our lives, or one category of identity. Even that identity is constantly, an ambivalent and slippery one, not something you could just call the male gaze or the female to-be-looked-atness or queerness or heteronormativity, or whatever the categories might be. And that's, I think, the way in which Svetlana and I'm not going to tell the story right now because I've spoken long enough. I think someone just said right. Was that you, Paul? Oh, so did someone say? Okay, I'm going to stop. So I think that coming back in this moment and in recent years, when things have become so flattened in terms of identity, I think, and identity has become so weaponized. And for Svetlana and I think that just doesn't capture the complexity of looking, of being a looker in the world, of looking at art and looking at the world. It just can't be winnowed down to these categories that have become so self-righteously activated or imposed. And so that's where I feel like finally, when I could get to that stage, I mean, I still think she and Paul probably had different views of some naked woman, but it couldn't be, but whatever, there's many more features than just gender that would go into that difference. I mean, every two people would have, it's not as though two women would have the same view of a naked woman, or any two people, so.
And this was exactly the kind of thing that we would end up talking about and discussing, and how do these things get.
We didn't talk about it. Did we? I don't remember talking about it.
A little bit, but not in the same terms that we would now, because the conversation has become so very, very different. I mean, I remember when I started that and we were first discussing feminism, and who did we read? This is the syllabus, by the way.
I don't think anyone can see it, nor do they care.
All you need to do is see it's one page. That's the important part. Laura Mulvey, Nancy, because now they're like 10 pages long. Oh. So, but the idea of the role of, I think, what we would now call positionality or subjectivity in art, those were important, and those were the terms, I think, in which we discussed it in 1988. But I think they still pertain. The idea of how much we own what it is that we are saying as our own opinions, that we are aware of the assumptions that we're making when we posit something. These were all things that Svetlana writes about as the new art history of that period, and that we then, really were brought up in. And I still see traces of it. It can be yelled out, by louder voices. But I think now we should. invite Svetlana.
Yeah, 'cause I
up.
want to know if she remembers that moment about asking her about the
Can you
naked
go-
picture.
Can you rescue us?
This is Svetlana. Okay. Do you believe me that it happened?
Of course you do. Thank you.
But maybe more importantly, do you recognize yourself in that description that I'm giving of a sort of resistance to identity-based claims?
What I say is I'm a person before I'm a woman. So the whole question is different for me. I've always said that.
I know that's
I'm not, so I just, the whole question, I don't feel how I see things as a woman is particularly interesting. I just don't. And and as I say, and that's why I always say, because I'm a person first. I'm more interested in what people think and see than what a woman versus a man. It just doesn't particularly interest me.
Right.
And I don't think looking at the book, you will, I would say perhaps my, as one of the audience referred to it as my vehemence and my anger, which I think is evident in my writing, is partly because I was, after all, a woman in a completely masculine field, and I became a full professor of Berkeley when there were 3 full professors who were women and 1,500, this is including all the medical schools, 1,500 who were not women. And what I thought is, I want to be one of those. I didn't think we have to have a revolution. That's not me. I thought, I want to be a woman of that rank. But I really thought, I wanted people to be, I was for people, basically.
But Svetlana, you've just said 2 very different things. You've said you don't, you said you don't, I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, even though it was 15 seconds ago, but you don't think, or you're not interested in the idea of looking as a woman or looking as a man.
I said, I did say, I do think that the vehemence of my work and the,
Right.
and the passion, to put it maybe in a friendly way, of my work, has part to do with my situation in the world. I agree completely, but I don't think the attitude is feminine. It's my situation that produces that. And I don't think it's very interesting to consider if somebody wants to do it, that's fine. And I suspect when I'm dead, given the world we live in, that's what somebody will do.
You mean the 4 out of 1,500? Is that what you're talking about?
No, that to think of my work as clearly the work of a woman. I think the only way in which that's interesting is the kind of passion. And I don't think that's particularly interesting because I think the substance of my work is larger than passion. It's the substance. That's what I would say.
I would say that
I
the-
really, I don't, so the Laura Mulvey question just doesn't interest me very much.
Well, that was clear then, too.
Yeah, and it just doesn't interest me now.
Yeah, and if I find it a lot less compelling now, and maybe that's also about
I was right after all.
Well, that goes without saying.
That's the important part. It's interesting because in this book you very clearly, in several articles, talk about the people who were important to you as thinkers. And they went from Michael Fried and Michael Baxendale, of course, and T.J. Clark
I
and
didn't say Michael
Ballheim.
Fried as a thinker. I never said that. I'm sorry.
Well,
I did not say Michael Fried was important to me as a thinker. I'm just interrupting you and saying I never said that. You can't find that in the book.
I think you're extrapolating.
You're just kind of talking a little bit
Fried was
loosely.
significant in, is it narrate or describe?
Yeah.
Anyway, maybe not important as a thinker, but certainly important.
He
as an
certainly was a
intellectual.
colleague who I admired. But
right, and you talk
What
about
were you
his
going on?
approach.
Oh, and what were you going on?
I'm just saying that and Michael Padro, Richard Valheim, these were all people that were very important to you and whose approaches I think that you wrote about. In particular, one of them was the when you were talking about patience in looking and time spent in looking at things. And at the same time, you are a writer, and writing was the good writing, I know, is incredibly important to you, and it was something that you certainly taught us to do, that difference between what you get from looking and what's writing. And I was struck in reading these articles from Vasari to Wanda Pereja about the difference in your writing from the very sort of self-consciously art historical Vasari article with untranslated 16th century Italian and lots of footnotes to
That
a
was
much
published in the Warburg Journal.
right.
That
So
was their style.
right to articles written for many different kinds of publications until finally these most recent ones, which are much freer in a sense in the writing, but the writing is just as engaged, just as tight.
Of course.
And I wanted to ask you about that.
That's a nice thing to turn to, Evie, because that's a more important point to make than she's a woman. If you see what I mean.
We can leave that point.
No, I mean, I'm just saying.
the moment.
That's true, and in
Yes.
fact, I began, it was interesting in the essay that Richard wrote on me as a writer. He didn't do what I would have expected somebody might have done, given taking up that task about these papers, which is to say, look, this is a writer who begins within the frame of a field of thinking and looking and such, art history, and then sort of moves away from that. That, in a sense, could be a way you would describe my writing. I'm putting it a little differently, what you just said. In fact, Richard rather just saw continuities in the way I ask questions, in the way, in fact, asking questions, finding a problem. That's what Gombrich, who was my sort of Dr. Fotter, as I always say, my the prime person in intelligence I studied with, and with great luck, he visited at Harvard when I moved from NYU, where I'd started, back to Harvard, and he was there. And his point always was to have a question. And I realize how often that comes out in Richard's writing on my writing, is art history. I don't even think of it, but I ask questions, or I leave questions hanging. Somebody might criticize me by saying, well, she just leaves a question hanging. Why can't she answer it? But asking questions is very important, and that was deep in my teaching, I would say, that you should find good questions. Not a good topic, but a question.
Assignments, weekly readings in a 2-page paper each week, offering an assessment and critique of a major or interesting point raised in readings. Each paper is to end with a question.
Is that me?
Yes.
And
You say a question.
I do that now in my graduate and undergraduate classes, where there are response papers, and they always have to end with one or more questions that the students want to pose to the class. And I didn't even know, Svetlana, that was from you, or you and Carol, whoever.
Well, I didn't remember back to that. It's interesting that you have that record.
But that
I
is,
keep my evidence.
is art history, ? Describe or narrate, ? Is another title of a very important essay. But I do want to just say one thing about this. It's not just that they're questions. Those are 3 words, each of them. And another essay that I love is No Telling with Tiepolo, 4 words. No subtitles, no subtitle in this book. I remember we were talking, wasn't there the idea that it might say Selected Essays by Svetlana Alpers? And you didn't want that.
Well, it does if you go...
I know, on the title
nodding
page.
to Barney, if you go into the title page, it's in there. It just
But not on the
fit on
cover.
the cover. It was left off the cover from a designer's point of view, I think very wisely.
Yes, it seems more you to have it is art history, Svetlana Alpers. You're posing
Okay,
this.
well, I'm glad. Okay, in fact, that's not the source of it, but I'm glad you think it is more. That's
But what about your conciseness? Because I remember, one quick thing, and I'm sorry to keep, I feel like I'm weaponizing memory here by saying, well, this is what you did. And maybe you didn't, but I remember that you complimented Carol's that there was a co-professor of the pro seminar, though she didn't really say much. Carol Armstrong, you
A
complimented.
professor at Princeton.
Yes, yes,
Yeah, sorry.
and was very attentive in other ways, but not vocally. So you, in front of the whole class, very generously, you said, well, Carol's a beautiful writer about art. She's such a stylist, and that's not who I am. And I thought, so that's probably another memory you don't have. But I thought, wait, and at the time, because your writing is so pared down, hers is so elaborate, and so, sort of self-consciously dialectical, I would say, and yours is so streamlined. And I think that's in part why we feel, the reader feels, that he or she or they is thinking it through with you. Because it's not this display, look at all the theory I've read, look at all the research I've done, even though it's actually a trajectory or a journey that we go on that's with you. And that must be self-consciously chosen as a style.
Yeah, I'm a very economical writer,
Yeah.
I suppose, but I'm also very hesitant as I think Carol is not. Doesn't feel that way. I feel hesitant in using words about pictures. In other words, I feel those are two different things. All writers don't feel that. I don't think Fried feels that. And I know he doesn't. We've argued about this. But I feel very hesitant in using words about pictures which are not nonverbal things. And I don't think we should swamp them with words. We have to let them be. And therefore, I suppose, sort of impulsively, there I am again, impulsively, I would say I try to pare the words down so I don't get in the way of the object I'm looking at or of other people looking at the object. I think Baxendall felt rather the same way. He's also a very, very economical writer, very different from myself, but very economical. So I don't want to sort of swamp. And I remember at one point, somebody asked me, maybe it was another project of Steve Graybard at Daedalus, and people were supposed to write about, and I didn't take it up, about writings on our art history or art that they really like to read. And I just wouldn't take that up. I couldn't really think offhand of a lot of writing on art that I'd love to read. I don't think that way. I can say Lawrence Gowing. There are some writers. Gowing is in this book, actually, a marvelous English. In England, it's painters who became art critics, while in America, it tends to be poets. I don't know why that is so, but we've had a lot of poets, and some of them, like James Schuyler, damn good, writing on, and some of them not so good, in America. But in England, it tends to be, as with, I suppose we can include Ruskin, but certainly Gowing, it tends to be painters, Fry, people who paint right, not people who poetize right. Anyhow,
You quote Gombrich in your book that there is no art, there are just artists.
No, the question is, what is art? And the answer is,
yes.
That can't be answered. There are artists, but there's no such thing you define as art.
Right.
It's a question of definition.
Right.
Gombrich deflected it very smartly by saying, you can't define what art is, they're just artists. And I always quote that because it's a way to avoid getting trapped by trying to define what art is.
And you also speak
Very smart.
in several different pieces in the book about your certainty, which I love, that there will be art without us, right? Without art historians writing about it.
Art
We're
history-
completely unnecessary to
Art
the.
history is a very short-lived field, and I think now it's coming to an end. I mean, I watched some interview I gave in 2015, and I said it then, and I would say it now. I think certainly the art history I was trained in and that I was training you people in is finished.
What do you mean by that?
Absolutely finished in America, and it goes on in specialized ways in Europe. France never really had art history, but they have the École des Chartres. They have special training programs for people who want to be in conservation or restoration or something like that. That will go on. But the field of art history is very short-lived, basically, and 19th century to now, and I think, at least in America, it certainly is finished. I think there really is no more, old-time art history? Let me put it that way.
And what about it? I mean, long ago, Tim Clark wrote an article about how philosophy is no longer a part of art history, but it once was a philosophical enterprise, was the writing about art history. What would you say is the thing?
Art history was anthropological, philosophical, so it was a marvelous, but for a very short time. And what was great about it, and what attracted me to it, was that breadth. In fact, I would always say to students who wanted to major in art history at Berkeley, don't major in art history. I didn't. I majored in history and literature at Harvard.
You're talking about undergraduate.
Undergrad.
Yes.
I'm saying, yes, I told undergraduates, do not major in art history. That's a narrow thing. Major in anything else and then come in. And of course, all the great art historians I was trained by because you couldn't do art history as an undergraduate in German universities, it was a graduate discipline. So I'm not quite answering you, but you see what I mean.
But I guess I want to challenge this a little bit, because one of the things about the publication of this book, to me, it demonstrates art history is not dead. I mean, not only the publication of your book. No, I mean it, Svetlana, and that's what I was trying.
I'm almost dead, so it's dead.
So I don't know if I should say this, but I guess I'm going to. I had proposed to Svetlana that the title be "I'm Not Dead Yet." Do you remember that?
No.
Well,
I'm glad it didn't work.
Sorry, I was thinking more about,
Okay.
Well, no, I think the aliveness of there's also the aliveness of the text, which is not solely, it's not the equivalent of the aliveness of the author. And I think that there are ways in which these essays, the reason I teach them, I say this in the introduction, teach some of them, is because they're good for conversation. They're good to get students talking about the difference between art and words about art, or about why do we look at why is it worth spending some time looking in this age where where we're being constantly flooded with images and information. Yes.
But look, let me say something that I wanted to remark on about the two of you, because it's striking to me, and it makes me think, thinking of you two talking tonight and my listening and responding, and thinking of me having been your teacher, reminds me of how very, very different your professional careers and writing and work has been from mine. And it also reminds me of the nature and the limits of mine. I might say about Evie that essentially she turned to what we might call, or has turned, to communities of artists, in particular communities of printmakers. And she came into art history as a printmaker herself. So she was a craftsperson turning into art history. And so it's a community of people working. In Richard's case, I would emphasize the outsider status of what he's worked on. First, gay, and then, as with Hirschfeld, outside in the sense of not trained professionally, a man who turned to painting without any training. Now, by contrast with those two, I went for great artists or a great tradition, which I thought you should look at the artists, the paintings, one by one. So this is completely different from what these two have done. Maybe what I'm saying is the kind of thing that I was trained in and had by Gombrich was more complicated, but the kind of thing that Baxendall did, that I did, that Padro did, that Valheim, another very close friend, I mean, all the people I wrote for really are dead. They were older, but they're dead. They weren't. Yeah, they were all older and they're dead. But basically, that was a very limited, specialized thing. And maybe when I say art history is over, what I'm talking is the art history I was trained in. That was then the thing that I went and ran with. What these two people have done is very, very, very different. And I think probably, as with your coming book and whatever your next book will be, is just fine. So I'm speaking again about a certain limited thing. That was my world.
But let me just say, I just want you to know, Svetlana, you could say that what I do is very different. I really believe, that I wouldn't be able to do what I do if I hadn't met you and read you,
Okay.
And right now I feel like our ongoing conversations shape how I think about what I want to do.
But still, that doesn't deny what I just said.
Yes, it does, because I'm talking about not just you, but your work. If I hadn't read Is Art History, I mean the essay, or or Describe or Narrate, or other things, I wouldn't think the way I do about art, about pictures and looking. So I'm not trying to flatter you.
You've got it. And the world, what I'm just saying is, when I say I think art history is finished, I was trying to refine and define what I just said. And I think the art history I was trained in, which I thought was sort of it, that is finished. And
But I
what
wanna
they
disagree.
are doing is not finished. That's the difference.
Okay, but I just want to say one more thing, and then I'll let you. Or do you go? You go.
I was one of the things that you wrote in Is Art History? I can prove it. I have the page number. Is you say to ask these questions is to acknowledge a common enterprise with historians, critics, artists, and writers of our time, and I think that was something I found out when I got to Brown anyway, which was where I went right after Berkeley. Something that was so much more real, tangible, and palpable at Berkeley than it was here. Now, I don't know, I have no way of knowing if this is a question of time or if it's a question of place.
What you're saying is more
that
palpable?
this the common enterprise of art history with these other fields. Certainly historians at Brown did not consider art history a common enterprise. They certainly did here, and one of my historian advisors is right sitting over there, Randy Starr, and I'd like to acknowledge his presence here too. This, in a way, Berkeley itself was a kind of crucible for those sorts of interactions. And that was the time,
is what I'm saying.
and the
When
place.
you say place, but let's
Yeah.
insist on time.
Right.
We are not
Time.
living in that time anymore.
Yes, but I just want to say this. I'm thinking about the fourth woman at the 1500. It's not a question about gender. It's a question about Svetlana. I don't believe. First, yes, you were trained in art history. First of all, you were a literary scholar. I don't know if that continued into graduate school or if you changed.
I mean, of course.
Yes, so you left literature for art history. That was one turning, that was one crossing of a boundary.
Was essential. After all, Baxendale was a student of Leavis. I mean, it was essential
right.
for us. Reading is a portable skill. You learn it with books, and then you take it where you
Okay,
go.
but your professors weren't thinking, oh, I'm training art historians, right?
No.
You left the field that you were studying. Then you were trained in the Italian Renaissance, mostly Italian Renaissance. You wrote your dissertation and made your initial fame, or maybe not so initial, by doing Dutch 17th century art.
Flemish.
Fle-
Rubens.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was thinking of your first book. I should, anyway.
Well, my first book was Flemish. It was
Okay, the second book then, The Art of Describing. I'm sorry. I, of all people, having read this entire book, which you have to read and buy, as my mom says, don't worry about reading the book, just buy it. That's, but I know that wouldn't be Svetlana's. She would be read it even if you don't buy it.
But go on. What were you
Yes, sorry. Then I remember that you wrote an essay, and it got published in a sort of feminist anthology, about how the northern art, Dutch art, was gendered feminine and
That's in here, and
right.
I'm saying.
And dismiss, wait, so you worked on an art that had been marginalized in relation, I know it's still European, but in relation to European art. Then, among other things that you did, you wrote on all these other, you didn't stick within your field of specialization as academics do. Then you retired at an early age and you've built this whole intellectual and creative world and continue, and then wrote a book, among other things, wrote a book on Walker Evans.
Right,
So I call you a category bust. You say I'm working on outsiders. And I think we're all outsiders. I think that if we're producing work that is in any way worth being read, then there's some outsider consciousness.
I agree.
Well, don't agree. That's not a conversation.
You'll be busting the category
You never
of the
agree
press
with
seminar.
me. You're just saying you agree.
No,
But
I agree. I'm an outsider in a way too. I absolutely agree. I didn't. I was framing or presenting you two as outsiders in a way to what I did. But yes, I would agree with you. I too am essentially.
So we're carrying on the tradition. I think we should, at this point, maybe Richard and I aren't the best people to ask questions of you, and maybe
Why not say that?
No, well, we're wonderful, but there might be questions that are even more productive from this audience here. And if I put my hand here, I can actually see you.
Or maybe just productive in a different
Yeah.
way. It doesn't have to. Okay.
Are there microphones being given to people, or
Here.
Okay.
Testing? Okay.
there's a question back there?
Yes, I'm really enjoying this. My question has to do with Walker Evans, one of my favorite artists.
Do you have a microphone? Because if you do, it's not quite working.
It's because I put it down, which is not smart. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I am very, very interested in Walker Evans, have been for a long time as an artist and obviously a photographer. But can you tell me when your book is coming out on Walker Evans? It's already out?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'll tell you, it was reviewed most marvelously by, of all people, Joyce Carol Oates in the
please.
TLS, but the American photographic world absolutely ran from it, even though I was very, very close to Jerry Thompson, who was my sort of native informant coming from Evans. So it did not, it was translated into German, did very well in Germany. The French have not translated. And America, the American photographic world, who I know, a lot of them I know, Stephen Shore, Jeff Wall,
Yes,
no,
I know all of them.
nobody lifted a finger. Even though those two guys, particularly Shore and Wall, really swear by Evans. He's central,
Yeah.
or basic, not central is wrong, basic to their enterprise. So it was very funny. It did not get, and Princeton, in its glorious Princeton, actually brought it out in a really marvelous paperback, which is smaller and compact and very good. And if I do say myself, I think it is a good book, because I bring to it a lot that most photographic people don't. A different culture, a pictorial culture, and a textual culture, which suits Evans, who, as you know, was a writer manqué.
Yes, wanted to be a writer before.
So look it up, it's available.
I sure will, and thank you.
It's called Walker Evans Starting from Scratch. It's a wonderful achievement.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm not really much in the visual art space myself. I work in film, and so a lot of this is new to me. I am, however, going to galleries quite often to see what is contemporary art that is out there, as well as museums. And I was curious, your opinion about the craft in contemporary art today, and whether or not the craft that we see in some of these traditional old masters paintings that you'll see when you go to the museums is, viable in today's current art market and the contemporary art space. And I'm curious your thoughts on that, how those relate to each other.
Well, I'm a big craft person. I think I'm put it a slightly different way. I'm more into making than I am into response or taking in. I'm less interested in audience than I am in making. And I think craft, the very making of objects, is terrifically important. And can you hear? Can you? I'm sorry. I'm not addressing. I'm not holding this up. I suppose I would say I got to New York in '99, and as someone has said, I got immediately, since I left the academy happily, I got immediately into a world of artists and critics. And the first thing I wrote, I think Alex Katz asked me to write for him. That's in the book. And that was a surprise, and it was fascinating to do. And I sort of began to feel I could deal with this world. My own sense is that the world, you didn't ask about film, but you asked about art and craft. I think that the world, the world of art that was being made then, 2000, 2001, seems to me to have been more, maybe that's me, I don't know why, but it seems to me to have been more persuasive, more clear about what it was doing than we now have 25 years. I think we're not in a good time, not in a good time at all, as far as the making of art is, or the making of photography. By the way, photography also is in a very, very unfortunate place at this moment. So when I got to New York, I think there was a kind of a denseness of making, a promise, a sense of really, part of it's not only craft, it's a history out of which you work, right? And now there's none of that. I mean, when I see all the stuff that comes up, I trot around to galleries. I mean, I really plowed Chelsea. It was Chelsea then, right? First West Broadway, and then up to Chelsea, and now Tribeca, I suppose. And I went all the time. Alexi Worth, an old friend who was then on the beat for The New Yorker, we would go around. It was just a marvelous, marvelous time to look at things. I don't think it's the same right now. That's my feeling. And I must say, a number of artists I know who I knew then, I think feel the same thing. I'm not quite sure what's happened, but there's some, the air is out of it. And I don't quite know why. By the way, the reason I called Walker Evans Starting from Scratch, actually a translation of a French expression, though it was never translated, à partir de zéro. It's very nice in French. À partir, parting from zero is their equivalent of starting from scratch, which of course starting from scratch is when you race, right? You put a mark and then you break out. The reason I use that is because unlike painting, I don't think photography, like Evans, needed precedent, Churiat, Agé, very importantly. But photographers do not work out of past photography in the same way that I think historically, and even going perhaps up into the early 21st century, painters have to have a past behind them. And I think one of the problems for Americans as painters was that they didn't have an easy available past. So they trotted off to Germany, characteristically, and got trained in Munich or someplace to get an available past. But photography had no such problem, so I thought it was much easier for Evans to be the genius he was in photography in America than it would have been for a painter. I think it was much, much harder for painters, but now I'm drifting onto other things.
Yeah, there's a hand up over there.
Hi, I'm one of the 2 graduate students that are here from Stanford, and Richard taught my methods class in my first year. It was my first class ever. It was during the
You
pandemic.
have the syllabus to prove it?
In my email, yeah. And I remember Richard really emphasizing this act of looking, and I think a lot of it had to come from your work, Svetlana. And I guess my question to you is, what is the role of looking in today's world? I guess a lot of the sort of literature I've been reading since, and I work also in digital media and film, it's about departing from looking and looking to sensing, and sensing as a way of perceiving things or something.
Looking to what was your word?
What is sensing instead of looking?
Sensing.
Like phenomenologically sensing with your body or sensing beyond your eyes. And so my question to you is, what is the role of looking in today's world?
It's a mess, isn't it? It's a mess. I mean, there's just too much. I mean, there seems to be too much to look at, which people aren't looking at, right? In other words, in fact, in the world of photography, people began to talk, images are being sent around. In other words, it's the transportation of images, not the looking at them, that seems to be a major concern, if I can put it that way. And it certainly does, for all the sea of images that are around, I don't think anybody's looking. I mean, who has time to look?
We're just sensing.
You know, I mean, it just seems to me it's not a good time. Now, you might say, wow, that gives, I'm just sort of saying this quickly, it might be a great time for an artist because they can say stop. Because one of the things about painting, you see, I'm a painting person. I'm limited in that way too. I'm not a performance person, but you see, performance arts are not about standing still and looking. They're quite different, and I'm much less interested in them than I am in something that is there that you look at. And that would stop people and make them look. So I'd say, here's a great time for somebody to paint and say you have to come and look. But if you notice, or I notice, very few artists are just painters. Most people are doing 95 media, or let's say 5 media, to get away from what seems perhaps, I don't know, I'm just proposing this, to be a kind of trap of having to have somebody stand and look at something, or sit and look at something, or whatever. That seems at this moment not to be a central occupation. And also we're into dance, all these things which are more en passant in my view. I mean, I love dance, and I was brought up in a family which went to ballet, and had a Russian father, and ballet was very important. But to me, it's still not painting. So I think it's not, I think it's a great opportunity for painting to give an alternative to the things that are passing all the time now, that pass so much. I mean, after all, you walk down the street, I mean, I do after all have an iPhone, but I never talk to anybody on the street. I still think of a phone, that's my age, of something you talk on when you're home, not when you're walking down the street. And people look at images when they're driving. I mean, to me, it's just, it's almost inconceivable, unseeable. I don't know if that answers.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your wonderful speech and your unique insight into the matter of art and artists. I'm really curious about whether you consider like literature authors or writers as a form of artist, and because I think you mentioned that art cannot be thoroughly defined. We can only define artists. I wonder your opinion on the subject of literature.
No, what I said about art, quoting Gombrich, was there's no such thing as art, there are only artists. And that's a way to avoid defining what art is. As far as literature, I don't know. I'm a great reader. I read all the time. So, I mean, and I don't just read literature. I read all kinds of other things. I read history, I read biography. It's not all fiction, if by literature you mean fiction. But I'm not quite sure what your question is. I mean, of course, literature is very important to me. I was trained as a reader. I mean, that's what I studied as an undergraduate. And as I said, it's a portable skill. You learn how to read, and then you can apply that skill to other kind of things, like paintings. which are not read, but they're attended to. You learn a form of attention. And it's striking that Leavis, being the teacher of Michael Baxendall and of a lot of other people I knew, Jack Goody, a marvelous, now late English anthropologist, a student of Leavis. Many people studied with F.R. Leavis who did not go on in literature because they had a skill. So that doesn't quite answer you. I'm not quite what is your question about literature?
I was wondering whether literature, in your opinion, can be defined because you just elaborated.
Why do we have to define it? Are you worried about having a definition?
I'm just interested in like your insight.
No, obviously to extend from what I said about the definition of what is an art doesn't interest me very much. It's the practice, not the definition.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
One of the things that really struck me in, I think, again, is art history, is you write, to think, to write is itself somehow to forsake the works. That tension between looking and matching of writing to it.
Say that. Are you quoting me there?
Yeah, this is you.
Okay, and what is it that I said?
To think, to write, is itself somehow to forsake the works. That the act of looking is one thing, the act of writing is another thing.
Sure.
In itself.
Sure.
Yeah.
Forsake? Where did I say that?
Page 86. You want me to find it?
No. No, I think there's a real problem. There is a danger, a problem in, because words and images are different. Now you see, the semiotic way of looking at things does not accept that. So there are many, many writers on art who feel very comfortable writing an art because they turn the art already into something linguistic. But I think art is not linguistic. I think that's completely wrong. Valheim was wonderful about that, and I had somebody who was a philosopher who stated that well. It's not so. Art is not a linguistic. I don't think turning art into a linguistic product so that you can use words easier about it has much purpose from my point of view. You just let it be, and letting it be is not as a verbal artifact. So I think they're separate. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I left literature as a study was, first of all, I just got exhausted by endless interpretation, but also it's the mess of using words to interpret words. The elegance of using words, there is an elegance about using words to address something visual.
And maybe
It's a distance.
Yeah, a distance.
And I was going to call it the mismatch. Maybe it's precisely in that, that we do forsake the work. I'm thinking even just that we have to stop looking at a certain point and to write. We have to look at the page or look at the screen.
I think of it as distance more than mismatch, and somehow distance, I haven't used that word, but that is a favorite word of mine. In fact, there are a couple of lectures put together as one in this book called Instances of Distance. I think distance is the situation between us and looking at things. And also, as a matter of fact, that's the argument of that lecture, distance is what makes for a lot of art. Art is not made by familiarity, but by the distance. When a Dutchman goes to Brazil in the 17th century and looks at the oddity of the people there, both indigenous and, unfortunately, slaves imported, and it is that distance between that Dutchman and those people that makes for the art. And I think, therefore, a notion of everything smooshing together in a kind of global soup is absolutely a disaster. People are different, and I think difference is extremely important. And I'm using that word rather than diverse, because I think the word diversity is a kind of hedging. It's trying to make people more similar, and I think it's the difference It's hard, hard, hard in our world. But I think difference is an essential nature of people in different countries, people of different backgrounds. They are really different. It's not diverse, it is different. And that's what we have to face and deal with in the world. And it's very, very often very painful, but also productive.
So maybe just one thing that, to bring us back to the larger project of Is Art History, or the fact of its appearance in the world and how that matters, at least how I think it matters. I think sometimes difference can make, or acknowledging difference can actually help the distance. It doesn't make the distance greater. I think it's actually a form of engagement.
Sure.
And so in terms of, okay, one more, I just want to finish this thought, which is, what I think happens in your work, that there is never an idea that writing substitutes for the work of art, to me, but the distance between art and writing is, the acknowledgement of that is one that actually can lead to insights. Or, you know, and I think that's very beautiful. Sure. But a lot of art historians are people who write about art. I don't know if they know that.
Well, art history isn't a writer's discipline.
But but it could. That's what I learned from you. It could be. No, and from Tim and other people at Berkeley. Like, make it an effing writer's discipline. Don't just have it be.
Tim, who was
T.J. Clark, sorry.
He overwrites.
Now.
Shut up.
I know, it's too much
Okay,
now.
so we have one last question.
Hi.
Please.
Yes. You mentioned that the art historian you are is no longer, and that what Richard and Evie are doing is something else. And I took that to mean, or to reflect on, that continuity of tradition of painting and people looking at painting and studying painting in that manner is also no longer. And in that vein, if this is the historical moment we're in, where we don't no longer teach painting the way it was taught, and art history is no longer the way it was, what does that say about our moment, our history now?
I'm not going to hold forth on that. You know, I don't know. We're living in a very difficult time. I mean, but we do, after all, without art historians there to support it, we do have a hell of a lot of marvelous art in the world, and there it is. So someone will pay attention to it. I mean, you know, we're not in a good moment. I mean, who could argue that we're living in a good moment now, right? I suspect it's not worse than the world. I think the world is usually pretty bad. We're just very aware right now, here and now, of how bad it can be. But I'm not quite sure what your question is. I mean, not having art history isn't going to destroy the old art. We do need, I think, better, I wish better art were being made just now. But, you know, one of my sort of taglines is the possibility of painting. I don't think painting is going to die out. It's there, and somebody will do it. So basically, I'm an optimist. I'm not a pessimist. I just think this is a very sad time.
Well, I mean, I will say there are people, and we do have to end, so I don't want to grab the last word, but there are people writing art history now, and it's different. It looks different, and it is the art history for the time.
But why
that
do you?
we're doing.
I don't care what happens to art history. Why? I don't want to end with you saying, "Oh well, people are still writing art history." Who cares? I don't care at all if people are writing history or not. The world does not depend on people writing art history.
I absolutely agree with you.
Okay.
Well, maybe we could just turn things back to the book to finish. Because, Svetlana, I don't totally believe you when you say, we don't need to, wrestle or whatever. We don't need to kill art history once again. But I think that putting this book in the world, and I believe it was Barney who first proposed it, is that right? Mm-hmm. And you had some reluctance?
Right.
Which maybe
I said that, and I've written that. I think I write that in the book, yeah. And I'm very happy I was persuaded.
Why?
Because I think it's a good book, and I do think it's a good book. I mean,
Well, it is a good
and
book.
also it's sort of funny, it's eerie, rereading what you've written over 60 years or however long it's been, and it doesn't seem quite like me, but it seems right. In other words, when I read it, it persuades me. I do think it's persuasive.
So whoever wrote that is brilliant.
I didn't say that.
Oh, right, they're right. No, I love
don't
that.
know
The art
No, I
historical
wanna make-
uncanny.
I want to say, this is because I want to say, publishing this book, look at the title. I mean, and it's, I think, saying, well, yes, art is history, but I think it's also, is art history, is there an art
Quite
history?
right. The title is ambivalent
Right.
in a neat
But
way that I didn't
Svetlana,
quite
you
intend at the
make,
beginning.
and not you alone, of course, but you have created an art history that is usable and meaningful for this moment. And so I don't want us to say, well, art history is dead, because look, here it
You can
is.
say it. I'm not going to say it. Fine.
Good. So we are saying it, and it really is an amazing book to read. Not just if you are an art historian, and that's what's so good about it. So but we do need to end because we're going to get kicked out of here at 8 o'clock. Oh, because we don't really ever need to end. We can just sit here forever. But I think at 8 o'clock we're supposed to end.
So let's end by congratulating Svetlana on this achievement.
Thank you all for coming as we meandered and struggled our way through. It's been a very good evening. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have.
And buying the book will make you feel better.